Is that helpful?
I had no
That
idea.
does help.
Does it help? Okay,
Yeah.
great. If that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Well, thank you everyone for coming out today for the noon lunch at the library. I was asked to talk about Fort Ligonier, so I brought some slides along that were part of a press release that I did last summer when we released publicly that we had found a heretofore undiscovered George Washington battlefield. So the bar was very high to actually make that claim, so we had actually been doing a project for about 4 years until we could come out to the press and say that we found this battlefield. So I've been working with Fort Ligonier. They've helped us develop this program and testing kind of initiative that I started working at the fort, doing excavations where they have a reconstructed fort from 1758. The Forbes expedition was sort of was a really well supplied expedition to take Fort Duquesne. And in 1758, late summer, they had made it to Westmoreland County, the present day town of Ligonier, and built a fort there. And then they were going to use that for their staging of their attack on Fort Duquesne. So Juniata College Field Schools, as well as the Juniata College Veterans Archaeology Program, has been partnered with Fort Ligonier for over 10 years now. So that's there's a really good relationship with the school and with them. And I've got a picture of young George Washington here because everybody knows about George Washington's escapades in the Revolutionary War and as president, but this is a time period when he was coming up through the ranks. He was just a Virginia captain and then colonel, kind of worked his way up, made himself indisposable to General Forbes, who needed to have troops that understood the western Pennsylvania terrain and the fighting style of the Native Americans and the French to go along with his massive army of British regulars and British artillery. But the Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and Marylanders, and even some Carolinians were also amassed at Fort Ligonier in the fall of 1758. It was a huge operation to supply all of that, all of those men and all those horses and all of that gear. So it was really a logistical kind of connected fort all the way back to Carlisle. And things that, so everything that I teach about when I'm talking about this subject matter, I tell my students, you only have to know between 1755 and 1758, right? It's like 3 really important years here in central Pennsylvania. Braddock's defeat, 1755 in July, was a shock to the colony, all the colonies actually. They felt sort of like the expansion of the British colonies was inevitable until Braddock went out to dislodge the French from Fort Duquesne. And before they even made it to Fort Duquesne, if you know anything about the Braddock expedition, they got headed off, jammed up, and defeated really severely. It was the first time that the British Army had ever been stopped in its tracks like that. Braddock wasn't prepared for the different type of terrain and the different type of fighting style that he would encounter here in the New World. They were used to European warfare, so the French had made alliances with the Native American groups for a while and even adopted some of their tactics. So it was a rout that was felt throughout the colonies. Once Braddock's defeat happened, late 1755 and into 1756 was nothing but raiding of settlements here in central PA, down in the Cove, this area, even part further east in the Susquehanna Valley. Settlers were being attacked and raided by mainly the Lenape, like Delaware Native Americans, who had been displaced for generations ever since the English started kind of arriving on the East Coast. So by the time they were being pushed around at this point, they decided to throw their lot in with the French and be supplied by them and actually help them tactically on the battlefield in an effort to kind of destabilize the British frontier. So Penn's Creek Massacre happened up in the Susquehanna drainage in October of 1755. That prompted the Susquehanna Expedition, where Fort Halifax and then Fort Augusta were created. trying to push back that envelope to protect Lancaster, Philadelphia, and really establish a presence in the headwaters that were traditionally controlled by Native American groups. 1756, in the springtime then, Fort McCord was an important site near Chambersburg. It was a settler's fort that was hit. Most of the men were killed. Many of the women and children were abducted. So Jean Lowry's captive narrative is an interesting account of what happened to her. And she actually was taken all the way out into Katanning and the Native American towns, then wound up at French Fort Machaut as a servant, and then traded up into Canada for a little bit longer than that before she rotated back to central Pennsylvania to tell the tale of what she saw and endured. 4 days later, the Battle of Sidling Hill occurred on April 4th. That's when the pursuers caught up to the Native American group that made that raid and that had some captives. So there's a great kind of struggle documented in the Battle of Sidling Hill too, and that's in Huntingdon County. That's in the very southern tip of Huntingdon County here. Another undiscovered battlefield that we've been working on with the Veterans Archaeology Program and some of our students. Fort Granville, again, so you can tell in 1756 there was a lot of destabilization going on. Fort Granville was hit and burned. That was over at Lewistown. The Katanning expedition was sort of Pennsylvania's attempt by John Armstrong to go back and strike the Native American towns instead of just allowing the fight to come to the frontier. They would go into the Native American towns in western PA and try to obliterate their warriors. Fast forward, so a year then progresses of similar kind of struggles until we get to 1758. The Forbes expedition is going to try to achieve what Braddock's expedition couldn't. He's not going to brashly walk out with all of his gear and then and wind up being tactically defeated. Instead, he's going to form a logistical supply train with multiple forts along the way, a much more metered approach. So by the fall of 1758, Forbes is dying of probably stomach cancer, something like that is ailing him, but he's still trying to finish the job before having to go into winter quarters at Fort Ligonier and essentially not accomplishing his task. There's a battle at Loyalhanna, October 12th, 1758. So I'll show you a little bit of slides from our work there. And then the friendly fire incident is exactly 1 month later to the day, an incident 2 miles away from the fort. We have another battle, and that's the friendly fire incident that involved George Washington and Virginia troops who accidentally fired on one another trying to defend Fort Ligonier. So the map looks like this. This is what the frontier looked like. Here's Fort Ligonier. We're talking about events in 1758. Here's the Katanning raid, Braddock's defeat. But then you can see that there's also action all the way out this direction. Here's Fort Shirley, Fort Halifax, Fort Littleton. I've been doing archaeology at all of these sites for longer than over a decade, I would say, sort of tracking this material culture. And rather than relying on the written record, we want to use archaeology to show us more about those events, and also to define where the sites are so that we can protect them. You can't protect what you can't find or what you're unaware of. So we try to define the edges of these sites and battlefields, and then work with people like the Archaeological Conservancy to protect them and interpret them. So here is Fort Ligonier from the air. It is a reconstructed fortification. They take you back to 1758. They have everybody, period interpreters in the upper part of the fort here talking about what life was like as part of the Forbes expedition, interpreting not only the lives of soldiers, but also the camp followers and civilians that were involved in this, in supplying this mini city. So if you go there today, there's a world-class museum, and then you walk out back here and can walk the buildings and the structures. This was excavated in 1960s by Jacob Grimm, and they based the reconstruction on his archaeology, on his work. So they dug down and found specific buildings and the outer retrenchments, and the artillery pit. These are all archaeologically confirmed for the most part. But I said that there was a battle in October 12th. So outside of the fort here, away from the fort's walls, we started documenting the lead and buttons and bullets that would have been associated with that first attack, essentially when the French and Native Americans attacked the fort the first time. Things we look for are lead is really the most important ingredient in discerning a battle or reading a battle. So, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about what we do with the lead. Not only is the condition, the caliber and all that stuff interesting to us, but we're doing isotope studies on it at the college, partnered up with Dr. Ryan Mather, who is a geologist. And isotope science really helps propel our argument for saying that we found an undiscovered battlefield. This is really a new sort of application in the world of battlefield archaeology, which is bigger than just here in Pennsylvania. There's kind of a national sort of sub-discipline of archaeology that's called conflict archaeology. So all sorts of people are interested in, the researchers from those various places are interested in this technique because this gives us another forensic layer to examine and to interpret.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Are all of those lead? All those six
Yep,
pieces?
all
They're
6
lead.
pieces are lead.
And they're formed like an arrow? Is that to be like a...
No, these are, this is spill. I'll talk to you a little bit about that. That's kind of like when you make molten lead and then dump it into into the mold. Sometimes some splashes out. And this is actually what we call spill or splash. And then you also, when you're casting your lead balls, you have to trim them. So there's waste products that are involved in understanding lead ammunition. These folks had to arm themselves, and they had to, if you were out of lead, you had to cast lead. So those are some of the activities that we're really interested in. So we went outside the fort onto what was, it's past Route 30, onto the country club's private property, and we started doing archaeology there with veterans, and very quickly, metal detector survey, very quickly started finding artifacts that belonged to the period and were likely part of that exchange that's historically documented. But nobody knew that was there. They parked cars there for Fort Ligonier days, and nobody understands kind of that the site extends way beyond the fort's boundaries until we start pointing that out. Here are military veterans engaged in a training program that we call the Veterans Archaeology Program. We go out to Ligonier for a week, but then we bring veterans in for 4 days and upskill them in, they're already interested in military history or whatever, but we show them that there are some skills that if they pick these up, they can then be parts of these efforts wherever they happen to be, other battlefields. This could lead to career opportunities. Veterans get preference by the National Park Service, for example, and if you have some experience with cultural resources, then it makes you an attractive applicant. So we're really trying to help veterans transition back to civilian life in our program. Not as much as a therapy, but everybody likes to go out and gets a lot from it, but we don't say it as much as what we're getting out of this or trying to provide for veterans is networking and also the opportunity to learn these skills. But then they're along on the ride. They're helping us find these battlefields, and it's fun for all of us, right? So the energy is very high in that respect. So we take about 12 veterans. Some of them have been with us for a while, and they're kind of our veteran instructors, and then we try to bring in new folks, again, that have career-oriented kind of goals, and we want to help them out. So I gave this talk, what was it, July 11th, last summer. This was the press release. We had CNN, cable networks were sort of set up to receive this media that we had found a George Washington battlefield that has not been located to this time. It is on private property. Most battlefields are already like on national park land or public land. This situation and some of the other battlefields I try to, that I'm working on and trying to define are on private property. So that's another dimension of all of this that we have to consider. But the landowners understand the relevance of this site. So we take, like I said, veterans out, and 2022, 23, 24, we were just there last summer, and we're going back again this summer. So it's kind of an ongoing program to collect as much battlefield material evidence as possible.
How far down do you have to, how far down can they detect?
So our detectors can go almost a meter, but you don't need to dig that deep. Most of the battlefield debris is within the plow zone, or kind of a 1.5 feet is really all we have to worry about. But yeah, we're looking for those artifacts, and then we map them very accurately. So I'll tell you the story of what happened here this day. What we know from history is that October 12th had everybody sort of prepared that this could happen again. So on November 12th, George Mercer had a unit of 500 Virginians out in the field towards the west, already waiting to sort of intercept a group of Native Americans and French Marines who were coming to attack the fort once again. They weren't coming to defeat the fort as much as they were coming to harass everybody and shoot their animals and like just make it so that they weren't able to continue their expedition. So what we know from the written record is that, and here's the landscape, the Forbes Road runs diagonally through this picture here. The Forbes Road was the road that Forbes had to create to haul his army out to Fort Duquesne. But after cutting that road, then the folks at Fort Duquesne used that as a highway to come back and attack them. So it's kind of a central cultural feature that we need to be aware of. And that's how we knew to look for this battlefield. We assumed that it was somewhere along the Forbes Road. So that's one of the ways we narrowed this down. French and native forces came from the west and were headed off this time rather than making it 2 miles closer to the fort. So this is the area of engagement, a very kind of a narrow floodplain with a stream called 2 Mile Run down here, a big hill and ridge behind and surrounding this area, so there's a lot of topography there. But the fight got funneled into kind of this main section along the Forbes Road. So Mercer and his group apparently favorably had the native group and the French on the run. They exchanged some fire, actually captured 3 prisoners, and were basically kind of mopping up the situation. So this is the first fight. You can see this is between Mercer and the French and the Native American contingent. Mercer's men had the upper hand there and then moved on to that spot. So they basically took command of the battlefield, processed some prisoners, and everybody else kind of fled. The French and the Native American war party, and that was their egress. While that was happening, George Washington's 2 miles away, but they heard all this gunfire. So he says to General Forbes, "Let me go out and help Mercer." He said, "Okay, that sounds like a great idea. Take another 500 men in the field." But this time, Washington didn't follow the Forbes Road. He followed 2 Mile Run, which was kind of near the fort anyway, knowing that they were familiar with the terrain. They probably used this to graze their animals and patrolled here before. So he knew he could reach this spot from a different direction. He did not get his information out ahead of him. He didn't send runners ahead and make contact with Mercer and actually say, "Hey, we're going to come help you." First of all, they didn't know that the battle was already kind of over and everyone was sort of relaxed at that point. Relaxed, but yet ready for a counterattack, right? So when Washington's group comes out of the out of 2 Mile Run's floodplain and starts coming onto the field, nobody really recognizes one another. It's late in the day, it's getting foggy, their kit is depleted, they're not all wearing like beautiful uniforms that stand out. In fact, everybody kind of looked like Native Americans. They were all dressed in like clothing that could easily be mistaken for the enemy. So long story short, Washington's group comes out approaches from the north. Mercer and Washington's men start shooting at each other. And as soon as you pull the trigger on a flintlock, it fills this whole valley with smoke. Everybody starts exchanging fire. It becomes even harder to see. And very quickly, men were getting shot and wounded. And Washington claims that once he realized what was going on, he actually stepped out in front of his men and like used his sword to clack up their guns and say, "Stop shooting at Mercer." And but there are other historic accounts too of that paint a slightly different picture. But Washington was just lucky to be alive. He was with Braddock when he got killed, so it's not like he was the greatest military leader. He was just like in these situations and made it out alive.
How do you think they finally figured it out? How did they finally figure out that they were shooting against?
Because you hear people yelling at you in English, and
yeah.
you know, they knew these people. You know,
Don't shoot.
yeah, saying, "What are you doing?" I'm sure everyone was pretty like heated about it. You know, once they figured it out. By the time the dust settled, though, there's 16 dead people. Again, mostly Virginians. There was even a couple British soldiers that came along. Some officers got killed there too. So it was a significant casualty event. So George Washington goes back to Fort Ligonier that evening and simply writes this, that tomorrow on their way to Fort Duquesne, okay, I should tell you real quick. Those prisoners that they captured had some intelligence that Forbes needed. One of the individuals they captured was actually an Englishman who had been living among the French, so we don't know if he was just a captive or if he had actually switched sides. But once they realized he was English, they said, "We are going to beat the information out of you that we need," essentially. But he complied very quickly and told them that the French were very much undersupplied, and that it wouldn't take much to go take Fort Duquesne. Once Forbes heard that, he reversed his order. That the day before, he said, "We're going into winter quarters. I guess we're not going to do this." He called all his officers back in after he heard this information and said, "It's on again. Tomorrow we leave to take Fort Duquesne." Washington is sitting there at his desk at the fort at Loyalhanna and records, "Tomorrow we're going to go attack Duquesne, but then we're to march tomorrow morning at Reveille, beating to the ground where the skirmish was this evening, and to carry a proportion of spades in order to enter the dead bodies." He might have meant inter the dead bodies, but anyway, he is admitting here that this happened, right? So we have the histories telling us straight out of his mouth that this unfortunate event occurred. Forbes really underplays it. He's like, "Yeah, a couple of our guys got shot up, but we got great intelligence." Like they don't talk about the friendly fire part. But the Virginians, again, are going to have to tell, "How did you die out there in Pennsylvania? Like when you go home?" And well, this is one of those situations nobody wants to admit to or really detail. So it was easy for this event, even though it involved a young George Washington, to just be kind of covered up. Because the next day they did take Fort Duquesne. Once they got to the fort, the French saw them coming, they burned it down and left. It wasn't even a giant battle, right? The French just kind of wait you out until they can't wait any longer, and then they let you have it. So that was the end of the Forbes expedition. They take Fort Duquesne, they establish Fort Pitt there. That effectively wins the Western theater of the French and Indian War here in Pennsylvania. But what we were telling the public was that we found this, right? That yes, this happened. Historians knew that it happened, but no one really talked about it much. So when we come in as archaeologists and say, "We found this site that you guys kind of know something about," it got a lot of attention. And then we had to essentially prove to military historians that what we were saying was true, right? They're not trained in finding the material evidence like archaeologists. They're trained in finding written record evidence. And for them to make a new discovery, they would have to find a new document, right? Another eyewitness document that would actually help tell us what happened that day. But until that's found, going out and forensically doing conflict archaeology is the way to define this through material culture. And Fort Ligonier is sponsoring this because ultimately they would like to control this site, in the future. When the landowners are finished with that, they want the first right of refusal to develop this as a battlefield. Like you go to Gettysburg, you can go to the friendly fire site. We're gonna have walking tours, signage, to explain what I was telling you. Like, where was Washington? Where did they come out of the woods? Where was Mercer's group? And where are the bodies buried? Because he just told us he was coming back there to bury the bodies. So we are doing two things: trying to define the battlefield, trying to see if there's any, if there's an unmarked grave, like hallowed ground situation there. So for 5 years now, you can see all these little dots. Those are the independent artifacts that we've found through metal detection. Everything is, it's either iron, lead, or copper based, like buttons, buckles, the things you might expect. And then the iron pieces are also bits and chunks of wagons that use the Forbes Road. So we can tell when we're on the Forbes Road versus when we're on a battlefield. And again, that was one of the things we had to convince people. Once we showed them the constellation of lead that was shot, they understood that that was a conflict. It wasn't just detritus along the trail.
And to find the bodies, would you be looking for buttons and things like that in a big group?
Yep, absolutely. Battlefield resources, some battlefields actually have trenches and foxholes, but this one did not. This was just an engagement. It was over very quickly. So we have to consider the cultural features, natural features, and then the artifacts, or the things that help tell the story. Military folks are trained in what's called COCOA, which is understanding the landscape and figuring out, where are the bottlenecks, where are the problem areas going to be, where's the advantageous ground. If you're in the military, that's something you're versed in, essentially. So again, that's another thing that's nice to bring combat veterans onto the field with us. As we're sitting there talking about this and they're finding bullets, they start talking about, hey, this makes a lot of sense actually, because you said X, Y, or Z in this position. We start making sense of it together. Cultural features, the Forbes Road runs all the way from Carlisle to Fort Duquesne. So finding that, you can find the road down by Fort Littleton, for example. It's all over the place. If you know where to look, it's in that trail. It's detectable in certain locations still today. So we define the site area and continue every year we go back. We want to make more of the story apparent. So that means finding more artifacts, essentially. There is here's the road. Here's a swamp or a marsh. And this is important because that's where this farm is going to be later developed. And it's also, I think, where nearby where the bodies would have been interred. Because down on the floodplain, the soils are very deep or very shallow and stony, so you couldn't dig a deep hole. Up by this marsh is softer ground, and they would have likely recognized that. If you're trying to bury 14 to 16 people, you need a large interment. So we looked at the slopes, the slopes, the bench, the floodplain. We basically kind of understand the battlefield from a natural feature perspective, in addition to those cultural features like the road. And again, that's part of the argument to be made here, that out of the scant descriptions we have, and there are a few other descriptions of this battle, this is how we made the argument that we're in the right location. Then we start trying to look at our battlefield evidence and then talk, how does this square with what we knew about it from history, but also what we know about tactics of the time. So we have Mercer's point of entry, Washington's point of entry, the bottleneck, which is kind of the stream crossing here, other pieces of key terrain that were interesting to us. This slope behind would have been catching overshot. So if you miss people and shoot over them, you'll find battle evidence like kind of up on these high slopes. So we're up there examining that as well. Here are some of the artifacts out of that constellation of metal detector finds. These are all British items, with the exception, this might be a French watch key. It has a lion on it, it has a fleur-de-lis on it, but the English could have had that too. But we like to say that it's the French officers that lost that on the field. They would have been using this site to sort of spy on Fort Ligonier anyway, so they kind of used it as an advanced listening post. There's the opportunity to find evidence of their camp as well as the battle. This is a ramrod guide to a Brown Bess flintlock musket. This is a shoe buckle. These tiny little things are sock garter buckles, and they're found on Washington's kind of line. These were probably owned by some of his men. We can even go back into the historic records and try to dig into who were these people. And some of their descendants are still alive today. But understanding the material culture as English versus French versus anybody else is also part of the story. But the biggest deal to us is the lead. If we're gonna talk about battlefield and the battlefield evidence, like these are all different pieces of ammunition that have been shot during an encounter. Some of these other pieces might be spill. There's a few pieces of sprue, which is what you cut off of lead when you're molding it. Essentially, it's the waste products. Here's another little sprue strip up here. So having teamed up, so normally conflict archaeologists would examine these by looking at the weight, the caliber, the condition. All of that is extremely important information when we're trying to do the forensics of a battle. But Dr. Mather and I realized that if you could tell where the lead was mined, you could start thinking about who shot this through like a supply chain kind of lens. And the thing is, nobody knew, no one has quantified those lead sources yet until we started doing this. Here's last year's lead. So we just keep adding more to it, right? And each one of these has a little bit of a use life history to tell, because lead is soft and it records everything that happened to it. Again, here's some of the spill and sprue. So we test all of this stuff, not just a bullet or a ball that's been shot at somebody, but also this waste material, so that we can really understand combat, but also camp, supply, kind of bigger issues like that. And what we've seen in the data, and I have to believe Dr. Mather, because I'm not an isotope geochemist, but he is, when he looks at lead, he arrays 4 different isotopes of lead and looks at their ratios. And the ratios change according to when the lead was formed geologically and also where it was formed geologically. So lead kind of forms in deep in the ground, but also picks up other things as it's forming and as it becomes deposited in various places. So, for example, Missouri lead is geologically very young, younger than these other leads we're looking at, like the European lead and this weird Canadian source that we're detecting. The Missouri lead is also radiogenic, so it jumps out at him. They're all numbers to me. He's like, oh, this one is Missouri. Like, I just have to believe him. But that is allowing us to map the supply chain on a much larger scale. We're seeing probably 50% of the ammunition we look at is definitely from Europe. And then he's working on pulling Europe apart, finding German, 2 different sources in England, like Cornwall is one of them. So we can actually pull that apart even a little bit more. But in general, we can say European leads, Missouri leads would have been New France. France, the French, were out in Missouri and Illinois mining as early as the 1720s. So they had already realized that they don't need to bring ammunition over for the fur trade if they've talked to Native American groups and they're like, yeah, there's lead here. And once they figured that out, they started mining it and producing it. So the lead that they had been producing for like 30-some years was starting to make it into the hands of the Native Americans and of the French Marines that were fighting. The English are always going to be supplied with stuff from England. Right? Interestingly enough, though, when the Revolution occurred, Pennsylvania became key. Fort Roberdeau, Sinking Valley, is a lead source, but it wasn't known about as well until it was developed during the Revolutionary War. So that's why we're not really talking about it in these early sites as much. And then there's a Canadian signal. Ryan knows it's Canadian just because of the numbers, but we're trying to figure out if we can find more of it. It creeps into our data in a very small amount, but it's there. So 2 days ago, we drove to Albany, New York, and went to the museum there to sample 65 different pieces of ammunition from Fort Crown Point and from the French fort, Saint Frederic, which was right beside it, and earlier, and then also a Native American town, a Seneca town from the 1720s and 30s. So we're And we did that because driving up to New York, we're like, that Canadian source is going to make it into the hands of these folks, or at least we're predicting that it will. So it'll be in ratio, it'll be represented better up there in New York. At least that's our guess. Here's the mad science behind this. Two different lead isotopes. Here and here are the ratios, and then as they fall out on this plot, Dr. Mather can say, these are English, these are Canadian, these are Missouri. Because of the way, once you plot them out to like, we're talking like 2 decimal places, and then so that's where they're reading, like out beyond 2 decimals, to see these differences. One of Ryan's students has perfected a method for extracting the lead. We used to gouge the lead ball, but museums don't really love it when you damage an artifact like that, even though it's a little chunk. Now we can do it uninvasively, just by putting it in some acid, timing it, and then getting it out of there. Enough of the lead gets freed up that we can test it. So that was another thing we were up there doing, was kind of testing that field methodology, or laboratory methodology. So going back to our artifact count here, here's that Canadian source. We only have 3 instances of it on the Friendly Fire site. And most of them are these little tiny things and even a piece of sprue. So I would bet money that this is Native American lead. Like these folks, they're supplied by New France, Canadian lead. Those are those pieces. Then we bring in the Missouri stuff. This would have also been the French and Native American group. So then we have to think about, does this stuff represent the calibers of the guns they would have had? The trade guns are smaller caliber than the British and even the French muskets. So you have to know all that information, but there's also evidence of not just bullets, but also sprue, and them hanging out, kind of preparing to do battle, right? Arming themselves in the field. So we have battle and camp information, and then we can kind of peel this site apart and talk about that. The European signal clusters differently. So if you see all that blue, and I back up here to the red, see how they're in different clusters and different distributions. Before, it was just all the lead was just plotted together. Now when we can say what mine they came from, that's when the historians were just like, okay, we surrender, you guys found the battlefield. Right? And that's everything together. So we can tell a much more vivid story with some facts, rather than that scant written record. Isotopes allow us to understand the colonial supply chains. Like I said, where's New France getting their lead? Once the Civil War comes around, we know where lead's coming from, right? Like there's receipts of Lincoln purchasing lead from Illinois. So like we have that, but in the colonial period, we don't have that. So this is the only time period this really like is super impactful and making this kind of forensic difference. It allows you to understand troop positions and also the progression of a battle, like over time, the hour and a half that the battle's going on. We can see Washington's entry point, different firing positions, and in fact, the battle direction changes on the Friendly Fire site. Initially, it's Mercer fighting the French and Native American contingent, so the bullets are flying this direction. When Washington comes up here, they turn, and then the bullets are flying this direction, right? So we have to go, 100 yards, 200 yards beyond those areas, and we start finding lead, and that's the overshot from the Friendly Fire incident versus the initial battle. Really quickly here, the potential for human remains is also at the forefront here. We wouldn't excavate the graves and like take bodies out of the ground, but if we can find the grave site, we would certainly put a monument there, and it would become recognized hallowed ground. The plot thickens because after the colonial era, they start building farms and barns and structures. And long story short, I'm pretty sure that one of the first barns built on this property probably hit the Friendly Fire incident grave, probably hit the grave of the Virginians. And when you're building a bank barn, you dig out a bunch of ground and then throw it up slope. And that's the situation we're finding, that right by that marshy area where the soil would have been deep, it looks like a barn was constructed, soil is thrown up to make the ramp and the upper part of the bays, access for the backside, and in that yard or in that kind of fill area, that's where we find a lot of a lot of buttons, buckles, and some bullets, but more items of personal adornment, things that would have been on people's clothing when they were interred. These people wouldn't have been stripped. They were they would have just been put in with their gear. So there is a new application out there where canine dogs are used not only for search and rescue of people today. These dogs are specially trained to detect the essence of human over hundreds of years. In fact, some of them are used to detect Bronze Age burials in Europe. So that's that's like thousands of years.
How do you do that?
Chemistry. Apparently, their noses are more in tune with the smells that they only associate with humans. There could be like a dead skunk on the site while these dogs are doing their survey, and they ignore that and only care about their job. 2 different dogs, 2 different days, 2 different handlers had reign of the entire acreage and only cared about a very small location, a little cluster of hits. That's what you want to see. These dogs they have a GPS collar on, and so they're monitored. Their behavior is monitored for like an hour or 2 hours, and the handlers just kind of watch the dogs, and then they go back and process the information. Where did the dog go back to? Like 6 different times they went back to this spot and then laid down and made eyes at the handler. Like those are all what you call trained responses. So the handlers basically said, "Here's your hits. Like this is where our best evidence guides us to find the bodies, or any evidence of the interment." So then we used those hits. We didn't tell this grad student. We told them a general area and said, do some ground penetrating radar, because we wanted to see a nice, beautiful grave. It doesn't usually happen that way. What they found were this green area they couldn't get into because it was all brambles. But where they did scan, they found what are called anomalies, and then you have to go test these anomalies just to see what they are. Some of the anomalies that they found were structural remains, which at first I was bummed out, and then I realized that we're looking at the piers and the foundation that actually disturbed the bodies. And that looks like this now. There's that area. You can see these little blobs that are associated with stone piers and stone foundations of the barn. And you can see that the dogs only cared about below this area, but also above it. So that's like where it was dug out, thrown up, and then also kind of downslope processes move that essence of human not super far, but also kind of keep it in that. So there's the ground penetrating radar then that we use this then to go dig test units. And so we're not doing just metal detection, we're also digging 1 meter test units in an effort to document the barn foundations now, but maybe there's still evidence of the grave there where they stopped their construction. These are the buttons. Instead of lead, right, there's beautiful buttons. Were not regimented by then. It's not until the 1760s that they start stamping them and saying what regiment, or putting any sort of military identifier on there. This is just mainly like the mix of material culture that the Virginians would have been wearing with their uniforms. Documented that they're depleted, they're kind of just wearing whatever they can at this point in the expedition. And a lot of these are like, that's a basket weave, kind of a gilt button. This is a really beautiful etched button that I swear has a bullet. That circular area is an odd snap. I think that's probably a bullet strike. So again, there's like a lot of evidence kind of supporting the fact that indeed this was the location.
Do you think 103 was from a very wealthy person that would have?
Now 103 is the one, good eye, that's the one that doesn't belong to this time period. That is a 1790s or button. It's a woman's cloak button. It's like a courting scene on there. So we think that one was later, because the Forbes Road remained a thoroughfare, right? So I threw that one in because it's a cool button,
Yeah.
but I don't think that it's period. I think
Okay.
that, yeah, it's colonial, but not, or early American, really. But and all of these would have come from England. It's not like we were manufacturing buttons here in North America at this time. So these are all like English cottage produced buttons until they started. The Industrial Revolution was just starting too. So factories and trying to figure out how they could crank out more of this was happening at the same time as this makes it out onto the frontier. I didn't bring any, there's coins, we find coins that sometimes predate these events by 100 years. We found a handful of Livonian coins, which are when Sweden was being an empire, their coinage was minted in the 1600s, wound up on this site. Because money then, you know, Spanish silver, English copper, it was worth its weight in whatever it was. It didn't matter that it was a Spanish coin. You would absolutely accept that as currency. So it's a really cool time period. But I should probably wrap this up and take some questions here soonish. So the historical proof of the friendly fire incident in general lies in the primary documents, recollections, people talking about it after the fact, and also oral tradition. Washington was being interviewed as president of the United States. His autobiographer asked him, is asking him questions, and Washington writes these things down called his remarks, which are on display at Fort Ligonier. He asked the guy to actually burn them and destroy them, but they obviously didn't. So Washington's talking about this event. They said, what was the most dangerous, what was your life in the most peril? And he said, this day. Because, bullets are whizzing by him, he's trying to stop his own men. And Braddock was shot and killed beside him in 1755, but he said this day was the worst day of his life. And it's obviously that he had PTS. It was his fault, partially his fault that event occurred. So, in fact, he hung it up and went home to join the House of Burgesses. See you soon. And became a politician. He said, I'm done with the military. After they took Duquesne, he was instantly out. And then it seemed like also he would mention to people, he's like, that place out by Ligonier, have you been out that direction? I think he was worried that the bodies might be eroding out of the ground, etc. Thanks for coming. It kind of haunted him. It haunted all of those guys, I'm sure.
There's also the oral history of people who would live in that area to not drink the water below the barn.
Right. Yeah. One of the first families that owned the ground, we were talking to the landowners. They said that their grandmother, when she was a little girl, was told to never drink the water by those springs. Right. So, and everyone's like, that's bizarre. I'm like, no, it isn't. Like when they built that barn, they probably saw that they disturbed the grave, but it's not like they were going to just move and they had dug out a lot of ground anyway. I think they just continued to build the barn. But they did say, don't drink the water. Last day of the project last year, we find a well just outside of the GPR block. Like it would have been detected had we had a stake 1 meter to the west, and we found it accidentally by a metal detector. So we're going to go back and look at that. That well could also be part of what dislodged the grave site too. So, and that would be exactly why they would say, don't drink the water there, right? So the archaeological proof then is starting to, I think it even complements or even outweighs the historic record in this case. We've got the right artifacts, the spatial distribution, the isotope signatures, the dog responses, and then we have a collector, this young kid who he didn't have a hobby other than metal detecting apparently. He found a lot of the buttons and buckles out of that yard before we got there. So his collection is over 200 items that are also, we would have mapped them and gotten a much better spatial kind of distribution of them. But again, I had to put that in there as, not only did we find everything we found, which is 370 some artifacts, then he's got 200 and some, right? So when you show the people the volume of material, these are not incidental losses, right? Last couple things here. The National Register of Historic Places applies to architecture, but also to archaeological sites and also districts, right? It goes beyond just structures. I think that this site is out of 4 criteria, I think we have 3 of them. that you could put this on the National Register, and that's our next step, is to make it official. Criteria A, it's associated with a significant event. That would be the documented event of November 12th, the friendly fire incident. Criteria B, it's associated with a significant person. Doesn't get any more significant than George Washington in the United States. And then criteria D is the bone they throw to the archaeologists. It's like, we might learn more about history, not from history, but from archaeology. So we could make the argument for any one of these and put it on the register, or you can make the argument for all three of these and put it on the register, which is what we'll probably do. All sorts of people help and volunteer their time. We have our instructors, volunteers, a bunch of students from Juniata, but also IUP grad students. The staff at Fort Ligonier. Veteran list is just going to keep getting longer and longer, hopefully. So, in conclusion, we are not out to dispel any Washington hero mythology here, or tear it down, or rewrite history, or anything like that. But we are calling to attention the fact that Washington was not, he was very lucky in his early days. His military history, or his military experience, on paper, is not that great. He survived, yes, but we can kind of dive into that a little bit more and talk about, obviously, this shaped his leadership style in the American Revolution, right? If he quit and then comes out of retirement for something that important as the Revolution, hopefully he's a better leader now, and he's definitely thinking about all these things that occurred in the French and Indian War. Okay, lastly, I'll leave you with a shot of this. These are our veterans. We even have George Washington there coming out to the site with us. This episode, or this issue of Smithsonian Magazine, talks about the site, our discoveries. Was written by David Preston, who is a military historian at the Citadel in South Carolina. So he was the one to tell this story. It's a really good article, and it's on the front page of Smithsonian Magazine. So we felt kind of vindicated that we had to wait 4 years to release the information to the public, but it was well worth the wait. In fact, this summer, I guess, Britt Hume is coming to interview us. So they're going to continue to tell the story at the national level here a little bit more. So with that, thank you all for coming, and I'll take any questions you might have.
So you're going back to this place again?
Yep, in July. Actually, in June, I'll be there at the fort digging right in the reconstruction area, and then 2 weeks later, we'll be out at the friendly fire site again with veterans. Yeah.
So assuming you find human remains,
Yes.
considering that they've been dug up and thrown around, you probably won't find intact skeletons. Will you be doing any kind of testing or anything on those remains?
So in this depositional environment, bone is probably all gone. There's a possibility teeth, or maybe really dense bone, like our heel bone. There's a couple bones that do survive longer than other skeletal elements. I think if it's been dislodged and it was moved, it's gone. The evidence is in the dog scent and in the button, in the personal, just the sheer volume of personal adornment is, we're not going to find anything that looks like a burial. I'm not expecting anything like that. But I believe the dogs. Like
That's crazy.
something going on there.
Never heard of anything like that. Never heard of anything.
There's only a couple
Crazy.
specialists that do that kind of, dog handling. Like our guy, you can't even get him. He's either flying to Alaska, he's all over the place because it's in such demand.
Oh, yeah.
For Native American stuff, for early American, prehistoric, and anything historic, all the way up to like African American burial grounds where they're typically unmarked. Like these dogs are extremely useful.
What about parts of guns? Have you found?
I showed that one ramrod guide. Usually guns make it out of the field, like unless something catastrophic happens. But you find parts of them. So I find gun components fairly frequent, enough to get excited about. We find more lead though than the actual parts of guns. We find gun flints too sometimes. They fall out and get lost, but they're not metal, so we might miss those with our metal detection survey. Right? Is that all right?
Fascinating.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Fascinating.
I never pass up an opportunity to talk about it.